The Crusade, my Black Templar, my pride and joy. Their number is legion, 10,000 points, 222 miniatures, and I love them all. Except these guys. Hey guys, Jay here. Welcome to Eons of Battle. These two models, the Land Speeders, are my least favorite models in my collection. And there's two reasons for this, a good reason and a bad reason. The good reason is I just don't like them very much. I don't think they look good. The bad reason is a lore reason. Why do Space Marines drive their own vehicles? It's such a waste. Space Marines are built for combat. They're peerless warriors. They wear basically impenetrable armor. Why would they waste their time flying their own stuff? It'd be like if Tony Stark suited up, he put on his Iron Man armor, and then he got in a car and drove it. It's a complete waste of the suit. And you know what? Maybe I'm being unfair. Maybe I should consult the lore. Early Land Speeder designs were relatively unarmored. Power armor. Better protect the delicate control units, without which Land Speeders are merely a large chunk of welded metal swiftly approaching terminal velocity. Terminal velocity, so 120 miles an hour. It takes a Space Marine to pilot a Land Speeder at the top speed of a Honda Civic. But Jay, Space Marine vehicles are incredibly sophisticated. No human could ever pilot them. In the book Soul Hunter, the first book in the Night Lords trilogy, a human being pilots a Thunderhawk gunship. It's fine. There's barely as many Space Marines as there are planets in the Imperium, but sure, we'll waste 2 flying a Land Speeder. It's really for the rule of cool. You don't want not Space Marines in your Space Marine army, but whatever. Let's get back to reason number 1 of why I don't much care for these things. The look of it. I don't really like the Land Speeder's looks, and I think Games Workshop agrees with me. And I have proof. This is the Forge World reimagining of the original pewter Land Speeder Proteus. And the problem with this model is it looks like 2 buddies hanging out on the couch. There's no armor to speak of, and it looks pretty ridiculous. Games Workshop seem to understand this problem with their next iteration of the Land Speeder, this chunky piece of lead. Actually, those helmets that the Space Marines are wearing are kind of interesting in that they come back later, but this still looks pretty ridiculous with the Space Marines rubbing shoulder pads in this tiny, tiny little air speeder. After that, we have our first plastic Land Speeder that we all know and I guess love, the classic Land Speeder. And this model is probably the least offensive. It kind of looks like a shoe, but like a slightly tactical shoe. And weirdly, on Games Workshop's web store, this is not the 3-sprue Land Speeder that comes in the box. This is the easy-to-build Land Speeder that came with the 3rd edition Warhammer starter box. So I don't know how they messed that one up, but, well, probably because they look identical. Next up, we have the Legion Javelin with Cyclone missile launchers. But Jay, that's a different model. Hush, this is a Land Speeder. And it's a slightly cooler looking Land Speeder to the ones before. It looks a little bit more like a slipper than a shoe. And in this paint scheme on the Forge World web store, it looks exactly like a Batman vehicle. Like with the black and the red trim, it is totally Batman. This looks a little bit better. The Space Marines still look a little ridiculous, absolutely popping out of this design. But it's better-ish. Although I don't want to spend $113 for better-ish. And the latest and supposedly greatest, the Storm Speeder Hail Strike. This model is massive and it is a box. It is not very aerodynamic. In my opinion, I don't particularly like the look of it, but at least it is big enough that the 2 Space Marine pilots actually don't look completely ridiculous sitting in it. What does look completely ridiculous is the 3rd gunner peeking his head out the top like Diglett from Pokemon. I'm not much of a fan. So that was every single Storm Speeder Games Workshop has ever made. And the reason I know that they also don't like the design is every one of them is different. If they were all just small tweaks of one another, then that would mean that they like the design and that they're just refining it. But they're not. Every 3 to 5 years, they are completely revamping it, trying something new. And A for effort, but I don't think they've nailed it yet. So I want to take these models and add to them to make them into a model I enjoy. And to do that, I'm gonna make the bases more interesting. I'm gonna add plenty of Grimdark stuff, and I'm gonna finally finish the paint job. I assembled these guys probably 7 or 8 years ago, and I've lost all of the magnetized options except for the ones that were attached to the models, of course. So I need to go through my bit spin and see if I can find those missing parts. I have a lot of bits. And honestly, this is kind of ridiculous, having all of these little jewelry cases to hold them all perfectly, separately, individually. I have big ambitions to maybe take all of these things and put them in little Ziploc drug baggies. That way I could fit them in one small tote box. But there is something nice about these cases. But I do only look in them about once or twice a year. I went through all my bins and ended up finding a lot of the parts. Maybe my organization skills are not as terrible as I thought. Okay, so it turns out I'm in a pretty good spot. I was able to find most of the missing parts. The only thing I wasn't able to find was another heavy bolter. And actually, I don't think this is the heavy bolter the kit came with. I think this is an Imperial Guard heavy bolter. But I did find a 30K heavy bolter that I can swap in pretty easily. Now, in the bits bin, I was taking a look at these storm bolters, and these are some pretty weak storm bolters. But I did find these chonkers, and I think I'm gonna use these instead. These are from a Storm Raven gunship, and they are much bigger and more impressive. Did I just say storm bolters? I meant to say assault cannons. Am I even a real Warhammer fan? I kit bashed these using the ammunition boxes from the Space Marine Devastators kits and some shields to hide the attached pegs from the Grey Knights box. After I managed to get the shields unstuffed from my fingers, that is. And of course, gotta have drilled gun barrels. And now, for the first time in a very long time, these miniatures are complete. That is a good step one. I think those big ol' assault cannons look a lot more ferocious than the little itty bitty ones that were on there before. Now onto the base. And I actually built these using really long machine screws to hold them up. And I can actually reference an old EOB video to see exactly why I did this. Now the first thing to note is that I am doing this to a base that I already had put together. Now what happened here is I actually had the little Games Workshop flying stand break on me, so I am doing this as a repair job. Now I took a drill bit and I drilled out a pilot hole, and then I took a bigger drill bit and I drilled my hole for the machine screw that I'll be using. Then I applied a little super glue to hold it in place, and I used another machine screw to help me position the square nut exactly where I want it to be. Now the reason I wanted to use a square nut is because when I'm screwing the flyer onto its stand, I might apply a little too much torque for it to handle, and if it was a round nut, it might just rip right out, but the square nut will help, has a lot more surface to help push against it, to keep it from breaking. Is that really what I sound like? But anyway, I still actually really like this method for flying stands, but I can do a little bit better today. What I really like about this style of flying stand is it is directional. If I put a magnet on there, these guys would just sort of be free spinning and there'd be no forwards and backwards. But because that nut stops when it's locked in, I know that that is going to be forward. And so that gives me the opportunity to pose this guy exactly how I want it. And I know that it'll always sit on the flying stand straight. I cut off the top of my stands, keeping about a ½ inch of threads. This was slow going with the world's dullest cutoff wheel and my Dremel tool. Then I cleaned off the old paint so I could start fresh. I yanked out the rest of the machine screw. It's been a trooper for all these years, but I don't need him anymore. Gonna be using some pine bark nuggets to give these guys some mountains to be flying next to. And this particular brand, Soil Cover, Forest Bark, Maseret? Anybody else read that? This particular brand is a little bit hard to find. This stuff is used for potting orchids. It's kind of a specialty thing, but if you can track down pine bark nuggets, I highly suggest getting a bag because it is super helpful for basing. I found some nugs that would make for good mountains and boulders. I found one that was long and pointy, so I cut it so that I had a flat portion to glue down to the base. And on the second one, I layered a nug, and the other half of the nugget I just cut in half. I vacuumed often. This stuff is messy. For Flying Stand 2.0, I'm using some plastic tube. It'll look a little nicer than the bare screws, and it was a perfect fit. I just screwed on the old tops. I held it up to my nugget mound so I knew where and what angle to drill, and then I made a hole. This stuff is soft, the drill flew through it. Then I shoved it in there with the speeder attached so that it was in the appropriate direction. Yep, I am pretty happy with that. Now they actually look like they're flying instead of just floating. Much more intimidating, much more cool. And I have to vacuum again. Yes, indeed, they sure look nice. Tragedy strikes. I was taking these guys off the bases, and if I unscrew this, I get about that far, and the under the ship sensor stock thingy can't make it past the wood chip. I was this close. I was this close to the perfect flyer mounting system. And it would work. It would work in any other situation. But, oops. I guess this one is going to be permanently attached. That's fine. They're not that big. That'll work out. That'll work out fine, but... To make the wood chips look more like real mountains, I took some milliput and shoved it into all the gaps to fill it in. And to make it look more like it was coming out of the ground instead of just hot glued on top of it. And to make the putty more realistic, I took a wet toothbrush and pressed it firmly into the goop to add texture. After that, I made a ring of wood glue around the bottom of my cliffs and sprinkled on some pebbles and finished it off with fine grained sand. With the base all done, it's now time to tackle the bodies. And there's nothing that I super want to do to change it. It's fine. So what I'm going to be doing is adding a lot more purity seals. And unfortunately, I used up all my purity seals on an Imperial Night, so I gotta make some more. To make purity seals, I took some tin and I cut off long strips about 2 millimeters wide. Then I crinkled them up with my fingers, then I crimped one end into a peg, and then I drilled a hole in the mini, put some glue on my peg, and stuck it in. Crimp, drill, stick. Crimp, drill, stick. Crimp, drill, stick. This became my mantra as I did this 10 times to each speeder. The Black Templar are very pious and like to have a lot of purity seals to remind everybody else that they are the mostest purest and the mostest faithful Space Marines in the whole Imperium. Well, I broke my favorite drill bit, but I got 10 purity seals on them, which fills them up pretty nicely, so victory. I wanted to add a fun little thing to the center bar, and so I dug up some skeleton warriors out of my bits bin and clipped off a head, body, and butt. I scraped off the old paint and plastic glued this fellow right where I wanted him, a crucified heretic. This skeleton is going to be attached with big nasty nails, and to do this I used sewing straight pins I inserted into drill holes the same size as the pins. And just like that, the model got even grimmer and darker. Well, the building is done, and now I'm in the awkward phase where I have to paint the model, but I can't get any paint on the stuff that's already painted. So... tin foil. Tin foil is a great tool for painting. I wrap these puppers up like my leftovers from Olive Garden. And just like my authentic Italian dinners, they're safe from paint splatter. And speaking of being safe from splatter, our Patreon has you covered. Over there, we have lots of cool STLs ready to populate your wargaming tables. New this month, we have a Bound Demon complete with ball gag, and we have portable modular trenches ready to crisscross your battlefields. If you sign up, there's a welcome pack that includes Dawn of War Space Marines, Imperial Guard, and Eldar Terrain, all hosted by Comics, Games, and Things. We also make Patreon exclusive videos where we critique viewer models and a weekly Discord hangout. We also have merch, link in the description. What do you guys think? Maybe I'll just leave them like that. It's kind of a fun look. I base coated the cliffs with a dark brown. Then I sprayed earth brown from above and finished it off with a generous dry brushing of gray, my standard Templar basing scheme. I want a little bit more contrast in the base, so I'm gonna spray on a little bit of burnt umber ink. It's not part of my Black Templar basing scheme, but you know what? I'm an adult, and I don't need to ask my parents' permission. This ink helped separate and define sections of the mountains, and I really liked it. It made me even crazier, and I sprayed just a little bit of black ink to add even more variety to the base. And I did a dry brushing of white to bring out some of the details. And then I unveiled my air speeders. All right, I like those bases. I like that boulder. That's a nice boulder. Now I have to brush on prime everything I just added and then paint it. And while I'm doing that, here are some fun facts about the land speeders. Land speeders were initially powered by gravitic reaction jets, which allowed it to fly through the air like an attack helicopter. But later, when the metal skids were added to the figures, these were explained as repulsion plates, which skim a planet's gravitational field, and the forward momentum is provided by a set of afterburning ramjets. All Space Marines are trained how to pilot land speeders, which makes me wonder if there's a land speeder pilot school with a bunch of beaten up speeders with student driver stickers on them. The different types of land speeders are named after natural events: tornado, typhoon, tempest, and storm. And the newest Primaris version, which lazily just reuses the word storm, missing out on the obvious choice, the land speeder tropical storm. Although you might think that the land speeder is named for what it does, speeding across the land, it's actually named after Arkham Land, the man who rediscovered the STC standard template construct for anti-gravity devices. Land speeders are very difficult to manufacture, requiring anti-gravity devices and plasma devices, for some reason. The traitor legions of the Chaos Space Marines don't have them, and speaking of folks who don't have them, the Imperial Guard used to have slower, worse versions of the Astartes land speeders, but this was later dropped with the explanation that the machines are too expensive and difficult to maintain. And that is 5 facts about land speeders that you can use to impress your friends at parties. You know, these minis are an example of something I've learned in my hobby career. It's a 6 strat. If there's a detail or thing I don't like, I try harder on it to turn it into my favorite thing. This works really well with painting. What used to happen is, if I didn't like how a gun turned out, but everything else was pretty good, I would just ignore it. But then that would bring down the whole project just a little bit. But now, if I don't like how a detail looks, I focus on it and I try to turn it into my favorite part of the model. And that's what I've done here on a model scale. I can't say that these are my #1 faves, but I do like them a lot more now. It used to be when I walked past the Templar shelf, I kinda mentally photoshopped these land speeders out of the picture, but now I'm happy to have them. And I'm finding a trend with my fast attack units, a red and yellow striping. It's on my suppressors and now my land speeders. I think I'll make this a thing and do this design to designate my fast attack units. I think using the bigger assault cannons is my favorite new addition. It just gives this unit so much more presence. You need these vehicles to transport the guns because they're as big as Space Marines. And we'll just ignore that it's the exact same weapon as the dinky old things with the same damage profile. And that crucified heretic really screams Black Templar. It really lets everybody who sees these speeders coming know what the Templar are all about. They're not the forgiving bunch. And that's what makes this hobby so great. It's all what you make it. If something is not working for you, you can add to it, repaint it again, tear it off and add something else to it. You never have to settle. It's your models and your army. And now, I have some old models that I never really looked at. I didn't really like them, but now, my gaze will linger on these minis from time to time. Thanks for watching.